Okay, let's unpack this. Just a few months back, late 2024, Syria saw this huge shift. Damascus fell. I mean, after almost 14 years of horrific civil war, these crushing sanctions and, well, just terrible economic mismanagement under the Assad regime. That moment, it really felt like it might finally crack open a door, didn't it? A door to reconstruction, maybe. A chance to rebuild. Some kind of hope, finally, for millions of Syrians living in just absolute misery. But fast forward to now, April 2025, and that door, it hasn't really opened wide, has it? The large-scale reconstruction they desperately need. It's just not happening. So the big question is, why? What's holding it all back? In this deep dive, we're going to dig into the source material you've shared, specifically a policy brief that tries to map this out. We want to understand why that door is still mostly shut. We'll focus on, that really complex tangle of sanctions and the competing geopolitical interests playing out now that the old regime is gone.
That's right. And the analysis we're looking at gives a pretty comprehensive overview of the different sanctions still technically in effect. And crucially, it digs into the potential consequences of keeping them there, even with this dramatic change on the ground. It's really about connecting those policy decisions made, far away with the reality Syrians are facing day to day.
Right. So our mission here is to cut through some of that complexity for you. We'll pull out the main issues from this analysis, look at the different viewpoints, the interests that are kind of clashing, and explore what potential paths forward are being discussed. Basically, help you understand what's really stopping recovery in Syria and why it matters so much, not just for Syria, but, well, for the whole region's stability. Okay, so let's rewind just a bit. December 2024, HTS forces enter Damascus. After nearly a decade and a half of just relentless conflict, sanctions pressure, decades of what the analysis calls economic mismanagement, there was this understandable hope, right?
Yeah, definitely a wave of hope.
That maybe, just maybe, reconstruction could finally start. And the need is, it's unbelievable. The analysis estimates 90% of Syrians below the poverty line. 90.
It's a staggering figure. And yet, here we are, April 2025, and that big, comprehensive, permanent lifting of sanctions, it just hasn't materialized. And the analysis is really clear about the impact. It's actively preventing large-scale recovery. You can't really rebuild institutions effectively or even do the basic technical work needed for reconstruction when these restrictions are still hanging over everything. The sources actually point out the humanitarian situation has gotten worse in these few months. Thousands of civil servants fired, support from Russia and Iran drying up. It's grim.
It really feels like a paradox, doesn't it? The whole point of many of these sanctions was to pressure the Assad regime, change its behavior. That regime is gone now. But the sanctions, or maybe just the threat of them, they're largely still in place. So what gives? Why are they still there? This is where it gets really tricky, I suppose.
That's precisely the dilemma this analysis gets into. There are these fundamentally different views on whether sanctions are still needed or even useful now. On one side, you've got the argument that, look, the original target Assad is gone. So the sanctions are, superfluous in that sense. And that thinking is partly what led the EU, actually quite quickly by their standards, to temporarily suspend some key sanctions. But then the analysis highlights this other very powerful view. You can't just ignore who's in charge now. HTS has those historical links to the al-Qaeda family. So from this perspective, keeping sanctions is seen as leverage, a way to pressure the new rulers, maybe push them towards, better behavior, more inclusivity, less extremism. And let's be real, there's a strong domestic political angle too, right, in the countries that impose the sanctions.
Oh, definitely.
Keeping sanctions looks tough, it looks prudent, it avoids the political heat of being seen to sort of enable a group with that kind of history, regardless of whether they've actually changed or not.
So the brief really boils it down to this core question. Does the massive cost, human, economic, of not lifting these sanctions now outweigh the potential risk of lifting them? Even with all the reservations about HTS.
Exactly. And to really get that, you need to understand the different layers of sanctions because they interact in complex ways. It's mainly US, EU, and UN sanctions we're talking about. So let's start with the US ones. The analysis calls them comprehensive, list-based, but the really critical part is their extraterritorial effect.
Right, the global reach.
Precisely. It means they don't just hit US citizens or companies, they apply globally. And crucially, they hit non-U.S. firms if they use the U.S. financial system in any way, like using dollars, which is almost everything. The material says these U.S. sanctions are still pretty much in full force. There are humanitarian exemptions, yes, and this limited general license 24, but that's set to expire soon, July 2025. And here's the kicker the analysis stresses. U.S. sanctions are primary. They're the big one. The 800-pound gorilla.
You got it. If U.S. sanctions stay put, especially with their global reach and how tough OFAC enforces them, other actors lifting their sanctions, it doesn't do much practically. It creates this massive chilling effect. Banks, businesses worldwide, they just won't risk touching Syria for fear of U.S. penalties.
Okay, so that's the U.S. What about the EU? They suspended some things you mentioned.
But they did. EU sanctions are also list-based sectors and individuals. And the analysis notes that in February 2025, they mostly suspended sectoral sanctions in really key areas too: energy, transport, reconstruction itself, finance, banking. And this was done quite fast for the EU, apparently acknowledging how bad things were economically.
But there's a catch, I assume.
Several big ones, according to the analysis. First, the suspension is legislative, but it hasn't fully translated into practical guidance yet. Businesses, NGOs are still unsure how to navigate it. Second, it's temporary. And that just creates huge uncertainty. Who's going to make a serious long-term investment based on a temporary measure? Right. And third, there's no similar move from the U.S. happening in parallel. The analysis even floats the idea that the EU maybe could have tried setting up a special de-dollarized payment channel, like they attempted with Iran Instex, but for Syria Reconstruction. But, well, that hasn't happened.
Okay, U.S., EU. What about the UN?
Right, the UN, HTS is still on the UN's 1267 terrorist list, targeting al-Qaeda-linked groups. And that listing, it's in full force. The issue here, the analysis points out, is basically stalemate in the Security Council, a wait-and-see attitude. You've got Russia, China, the U.S., all with different concerns and priorities. Getting consensus to take HTS off that list, extremely difficult right now.
Yeah.
And that listing makes it really hard, maybe impossible, for big international players, governments, global organizations, major companies to deal directly with HTS ministers or officials who are technically prescribed individuals.
Wow. Okay, so you've got this web. U.S. sanctions casting a huge shadow, making everyone nervous. The EU trying something, but it's temporary, unclear. And the UN listing, basically blackballing the new authorities for many international actors. It sounds like a recipe for gridlock.
Yeah.
Total uncertainty for anyone thinking about investing or helping rebuild Syria.
It absolutely is. And then, layered on top of all that, as the material makes clear, you have the clashing geopolitical interests of all the outside players. These interests often drive the sanctions decisions more than the actual situation in Syria itself. Take the U.S. The analysis suggests Syria just isn't, frankly, a top 10 foreign policy issue right now. Decision-making is very centralized, and key figures apparently still see HTS mainly as extremists. Plus, U.S. foreign policy often looks for a clear deal, a quid pro quo, right? And it's not obvious what Syria can offer the U.S. right now. But the analysis does mention some U.S. interests that could be leverage points. Things like preventing ISIS from coming back, ensuring a sort of soft landing for the Kurdish YPG region, keeping allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel happy. These are factors, even if they aren't driving sanctions relief yet.
Okay, what about Turkey? They're right next door.
Turkey's goals are really complex, sometimes even contradictory. They definitely want the Kurdish proto-state in the northeast gone. They desperately want Syrian refugees in Turkey to go home. And they see big opportunities for Turkish businesses in Syria's reconstruction, aiming for economic influence and a friendly government in Damascus. The analysis notes that maybe finding a way to integrate the YPG-PYD into new Syrian structures could unlock some of Turkey's other goals. But the bottom line for Turkey, they want sanctions lifted fully, permanently, ASAP, so that reconstruction money can start flowing.
And the EU, you mentioned their caution.
Yeah, the EU, according to the material, wants to see a fundamentally different kind of government than Assad's more pluralistic, more representative. They also want that soft landing for the YPG-PYD, and they want refugees to return eventually. So these political goals, plus the uncertainty about HTS, lead to that cautious approach suspension, not full lifting.
What about Syria's other neighbors? Jordan, the Gulf countries.
Their top priority, especially for Jordan and Saudi Arabia, is stability. Plain and simple. Keep ISIS down, stop the flood of Captagon drugs coming out of Syria, prevent new insurgencies or outside meddling. So at the very least, they want recovery and reconstruction to happen to stabilize things. They're pushing hard for sanctions to be fully and permanently lifted, like yesterday. The brief says they've already called for it.
And Israel. Their interests sound quite different.
Very different, according to the analysis. It suggests Israel is focused on maintaining a buffer zone using the HTS presence, framed perhaps exaggeratedly as a threat, to justify interventions. Basically, the analysis argues Israel benefits if Syria stays weak, divided, maybe polarized. So sanctions that hinder Syria's recovery, they actually kind of align with Israel's perceived security interests.
So connecting those dots, the analysis seems to show this strange dynamic. The countries closest to Syria, Turkey, Jordan, the Gulf, who feel the immediate heat from instability, refugees, drugs. They're the ones most desperate for reconstruction to start. They see the link between poverty and chaos.
Right, they live with the consequences directly.
But they're blocked because the main actors holding the sanctioned power, the U.S. and EU, are further away. And their decisions seem driven more by politics, security concerns back home, maybe inertia, leading to this caution or disengagement from the sheer economic urgency on the ground.
That's exactly the disconnect the analysis highlights. And to really feel the human weight of this policy tangle, you have to look at the facts inside Syria and listen to Syrian civil society voices, which the sources thankfully include. The economic stats are just brutal. Syria's GDP in 2024, less than half what it was pre-war. In 2011, inflation, unemployment, through the roof. The analysis says 3 out of 4 Syrians need aid just to get by. We mentioned 90% poverty, but it gets worse. Nearly half the population is in extreme poverty. Half the kids aren't in school. Energy, trade, massive collapse compared to before.
Generations of progress wiped out.
Exactly. The inescapable conclusion is that on the current path, Syria faces economic misery for decades, a whole generation at least.
And this is where those Syrian civil society perspectives presented in the analysis feel so vital. They basically say the Western approach, heavy on sanctions, maybe talking about minorities, but often without real diplomatic presence, feels like trying to influence things from afar. Right? Not really partnering with Syrians.
Yes, influencing from abroad versus partnering.
And they argue it misses the fundamental point. The crushing socioeconomic reality people face every single day.
Their argument, as laid out in the analysis, is really pragmatic. They're saying, look, you can't expect any meaningful political transition if people can't even meet their basic needs, if the economy is dead. People struggling to survive just don't have the bandwidth for civic engagement, for democracy building. The collapsing economy, they argue, blocks everything else needed for a real transition. Reforming administration, security forces, building civil society, dealing with past atrocities through transitional justice. And they stress humanitarian aid. Yes, it's critical, life-saving, but it is not a substitute for actual reconstruction and private investment that could create jobs and sustainable recovery.
And they make this really powerful point. Conditioning full sanctions relief only on achieving some perfect inclusive political transition first. It's backward. It sets policy up to fail. Because in their view, you need rapid economic improvement first to even create the space for that kind of positive political change. They also suggest, interestingly, that focusing too much on minority protection, however well meant, can sometimes backfire, maybe fuel tensions. Reframing it around shared citizenship, rights for everyone, might be better.
It's a nuanced point, and the analysis adds another practical problem for civil society groups themselves. If sanctions stay, these CSOs desperately need clear guidance from the sanctioning governments. How can they actually work? How do they interact with necessary government bodies? How do they navigate these lists of sanctioned people or groups without falling foul of the rules themselves? That kind of clear, practical guidance. The material says it's just not there right now. So with all the sanctions maze, the competing agendas, the devastation inside Syria, the analysis suggests that if we don't see comprehensive permanent sanctions relief soon, Syria is probably heading for what they call a patchwork of sanctions.
A patchwork. Okay, what does that look like practically?
It means maybe you get some temporary exemptions here and there, maybe some specific licenses for certain projects. It might allow for some very limited recovery mapping, maybe some basic needs projects. But, crucially, it prevents the big nationwide reconstruction effort that's needed, rebuilding state institutions, major infrastructure, and it definitely doesn't provide the long-term certainty needed to attract any serious private investment, which is what you need for real recovery beyond just aid.
And the likely results of that patchwork scenario. The analysis paints a picture.
Yeah, and it's not pretty. The medium-term forecast includes things like recurring instability driven by domestic anger over lack of jobs, lack of hope, more scope for foreign military interventions, Israel, Turkey, maybe even Iran getting drawn back in, illicit trade booming drugs like Captagon, weapons, organized crime flourishing, local violence spilling across borders, and, worryingly, a potential resurgence of ISIS-style extremism, especially if people feel utterly desperate with no other options.
That sounds incredibly dangerous, not just for Syria.
Exactly. The analysis warns these things don't stay contained. They can spread regionally, fuel wider instability, contribute to these polycrises we hear about, especially if conflict escalates again or Israel steps up military actions. And this kind of future, it's far more likely to push even more Syrians to flee the country, not encourage refugees to return home.
Okay, so the analysis lays out a pretty bleak trajectory if the status quo or this patchwork continues. But does it say this future is locked in? Is it inevitable?
No, it argues strongly that it's not inevitable. The analysis makes the case that fully lifting all sanctions permanently is possible, with the obvious exception, of course, for sanctions targeting specific people or companies tied directly to the old Assad regime's crimes and corruption. Those should stay.
But listing everything else, that sounds like a big leap of faith, doesn't it? Given the concerns about HTS.
It is. The material absolutely acknowledges it means taking a calculated risk. A gamble, really. It requires being willing to test the sincerity of HTS's public statements about changing, about moving away from extremism, about allowing more inclusive governance, though the analysis also makes a counterpoint. If HTS isn't genuine, sanctions probably won't change their fundamental nature anyway, just maybe elicit some cosmetic concessions. So maintaining them carries this huge cost for potentially very little actual gain in that scenario too.
Okay, so if the idea is to move away from using sanctions as the main tool to try to force change in HTS, what's the alternative approach the material suggests?
It's a pretty significant shift in thinking towards using positive inducements. So instead of just sticks, offering carrots. Things like international recognition, normalizing relations step by step, offering substantial economic aid packages. But, and this is key, tying these carrots to clear, measurable benchmarks, specifically on output inclusivity, meaning HTS has to demonstrably show they are including diverse groups and perspectives in how they actually govern, not just talking about it.
So proof is in the pudding.
Exactly. The analysis suggests this could create a safer path for HTS to genuinely share power, maybe even transition power later on, and potentially it could help rebuild Western influence, which, let's face it, has probably been damaged because many Syrians blame sanctions for their suffering.
And framing the risk one more time, if this kind of comprehensive relief doesn't happen, if the patchwork continues.
The risk, the analysis argues, is paying that very high price of ongoing instability spilling out from an impoverished, desperate Syria. Plus, by keeping Syria economically isolated from the West, you might just push its rulers towards other partners, Russia, Iran, maybe others who have very different agendas and aren't likely to prioritize inclusive governance or regional stability in the same way.
So does the brief offer concrete steps? Like what could actually be done now?
It does. It lays out some specific practical things the U.S., EU, and UN could potentially do, even short of a full, immediate, permanent lifting by everyone. For the U.S., one step is making that general license 24 permanent, not letting it expire soon. That provides some certainty for specific activities. A bigger step, downgrading HTS's designation from FTO, Foreign Terrorist Organization, to SDGT, Specially Designated Global Terrorist.
What's the difference practically?
It's significant. An SDGT listing still imposes restrictions, but crucially, it removes the criminal penalties for simply interacting or working with the designated group. That makes engagement much, much easier for aid groups, diplomats, maybe even businesses eventually. And the material suggests Saudi Arabia, with its focus on regional stability and its influence in D.C., might be a key player to lobby for such moves.
Okay, what about the EU? Beyond making the current suspension permanent.
Making it permanent is the first big step proposed. Then, the analysis suggests the EU could seriously explore setting up an upgraded Instex-like mechanism, a dedicated channel for de-dollarized reconstruction finance, building on their past experience. It wouldn't solve everything, but it could be a tangible step. Or, alternatively, they could try to negotiate a really broad, permanent U.S. exemption, specifically for a multi-donor trust fund for reconstruction run maybe by the EU or World Bank, pooling European and Gulf money.
And the UN Security Council, where they're currently deadlocked.
The suggestion there is to give the UN Special Envoy for Syria a clear mandate to negotiate HTS's removal from that 1267 terrorist list. But, importantly, making that delisting conditional on HTS taking real, verifiable steps, things like institutionalizing the fight against ISIS remnants and demonstrably removing foreign fighters associated with HTS from the country, things directly related to the list's original purpose. And maybe, as a goodwill gesture during those talks, granting temporary travel waivers for key HTS figures currently banned from travel, like al-Shara.
Right, to allow diplomacy to happen.
Yeah.
And the analysis mentioned one underlying thing needed no matter what.
Yes, absolutely fundamental. Serious reform of Syria's banking sector. It's needed to tackle illicit finance, sure, but also just to reconnect Syria to the global financial system at all. The current reliance on informal money networks, hawala, cash, it's a massive barrier to any serious investment or even large-scale aid program.
So pulling it all together, the core message from the analysis seems pretty stark.
It is. It's basically saying Syria's economy is in such dire straits that even relatively small, pragmatic steps on sanctions could make a huge positive difference to millions of ordinary people's lives.
And ultimately, the choice presented in this material seems to boil down to this fundamental question for the international community, especially those holding the sanction levers. Are you willing to take some calculated risks, maybe starting small, making exemptions permanent, using positive incentives to try and create the economic conditions on the ground that might, just might, allow a more rights-respecting representative government to emerge? Or is the alternative, maintaining strict sanctions due to caution or geopolitics, going to end up contributing to exactly what everyone wants to avoid? More insurgency, more extremism, and instability that spreads far beyond Syria's borders.
It definitely leaves you, the listener, with a challenging thought to mull over. Given this incredibly complex mix of geopolitics we've talked about and the sheer desperation inside Syria, how much potential does this proposed shift towards economic engagement and positive rewards really have to change Syria's path? And maybe more broadly, what does this whole situation tell us about using sanctions as our main policy tool in these incredibly messy post-conflict environments? Does it work as intended, or does it risk creating even bigger problems down the line?